Welcome to the Glucose Never Lies podcast. I'm John Pemberton, a diabetes educator and researcher living with type 1 diabetes since 2008. I started the Glucose Never Lies website when my son tested positive for type 1 diabetes antibodies. In that moment, I realized I needed to build a resource strong enough to guide anyone who might care for him. At first, that meant writing clear, actionable management guides, but listening to Peter Attia's The Drive taught me something. Peter's conversations provide depth across nutrition, exercise, pharmacology, sleep, and much more. But I always find myself wondering, how does this information apply to people with type 1 diabetes? And this podcast is my attempt to fill that gap. I have access to the world's leading researchers and thought leaders in type 1 diabetes. That gives me a unique opportunity to combine lived experience, professional expertise, and cutting-edge science, and to share it all on here in conversation. But an important note, this podcast is for informational purposes only. These conversations share knowledge and experiences. They do not create a therapeutic relationship. So, let's get started. Welcome to the Glucose Never Lies podcast. And today, I am definitely excited to have Associate Professor Jane Yardley with us from she teaches at the School of Kinesiology and Physical Activity Sciences at the University of Montreal and undertakes research at the Montreal Clinical Research Institute. Have I got that right?
Yep, that works. I've got a few other affiliations, but we don't need to go into those because it gets complicated after a while.
Okay, perfect. But my actual better introduction for Jane is I've seen her present and I've read a lot of her research over the years. And as someone who's a strong academic and very sort of powerful and precise on stage, you kind of get this perception of someone. And then I remember you reaching out when we were speaking at the same event in Italy saying, do you fancy going grabbing a beer? And I was like, yeah, okay. And you're the really most humble and kind person. So I just want to sort of say thank you for that, because that's it's always interesting when you have this perception of someone and then you actually get to meet someone. It's usually different.
And it's so much better seeing people in person too, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. I think what would be really helpful from the listener's perspective. So this topic that we're going to delve into today, which is the difference between males and females with a specific focus on exercise, what happens during exercise, what are some of the variables we need to think about for type 1 diabetes, what do we know, what do we not know. I have had a lot of people, obviously mainly females, who are interested to know why are the differences, why there's not much research. But I think what would be really helpful for the listeners is to get an idea of a brief trajectory, what kind of work you've done and what's got you interested in this particular area.
Well, I'm kind of one of those people. We have a joke in my lab that I get distracted by shiny objects, and every now and then I'll have this thought, and the sign that I give to say that I've gone off on a tangent is I literally go squirrel. It's from a movie where there's a character that's, distracted by squirrels. And that kind of describes my research career quite a bit as well, because I'll be working on a project and we'll find something interesting in that project and I'll go off on a tangent because of that outcome. So I really started out doing mostly work with resistance exercise. And I was really interested in resistance exercise. And that came from my background as an athlete, as somebody who trained and really saw the benefits of resistance exercise. And then when we started looking at it in the context of type 1 diabetes, we started seeing some really nice glycemic benefits as well, like lower drops in blood glucose, even though there was a tendency for more late post-exercise hypoglycemia. And then from that, we started looking at exercise intensity a little bit more, and I started doing some work in high-intensity interval exercise. I had a disagreement with a postdoc supervisor who was convinced that higher intensity intervals would be associated with less hypoglycemia, and I was like, well, maybe during exercise, but I swear we're going to see more after exercise. Like, that's the physiology. You store your glucose in your muscles. When you do those high-intensity activities, you rely on what's in the muscles, not what's in the blood, so you don't see the big drops during exercise, but you see them after exercise. And so that's where I got into some more of that work around high intensity interval exercise. And then this is another, I'm not a person who gets into a lot of disagreements, but I think it's mostly differences of opinion over interpretation in the data.
That's good. That's good old challenging stuff. That's how you move. That's how ideas are generated. You can't be all singing from the same hymn sheet. There's got to be some challenge. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I was looking at some of these high intensity interval exercise studies, and I was like, why do some of these studies show increases in glucose and other ones show decreases in glucose? And when I took a really close look, and I had a spreadsheet with all the different factors, and I was like, oh, every single time glucose goes up, it's because they're fasted participants. I wonder if that's the key. And so that's where I got into these studies where we're comparing taking the same people doing exactly the same exercise protocol, but they'll do it once in the morning before breakfast and once in the afternoon on a separate day after lunch. And sure enough, we saw these really clear trajectories. And while I was doing all of that, I didn't have any graduate students. I was at a satellite faculty at the University of Alberta where it was all undergraduate. So I was in the lab a lot with participants, talking to the participants. And what happened was that we had to schedule participants for multiple tests. And I didn't think too much about it at the time, but I'd be like, okay, I had female participants. Are you available next week? And it happened more than once that the participant would pull out her calendar. She'd look at it. She'd go, well, yeah, I am, but I'm going to be getting my period. So that's really just, my glucose is going to be all over the place. It's not a good time. And so I was like, is that a thing? Are there glucose fluctuations associated with the menstrual cycle? And this was about 10 years ago. And there wasn't much published on it. But sure enough, there were a few studies showing that in the luteal phase, which is that last week before the period, there tends to be higher glucose levels. And that for a lot of females as well, once they start their period, there's a big drop in glucose and a more tendency towards hypoglycemia in that first phase of what we call the follicular phase, the first week of the follicular phase. So I thought, nobody's doing any work in this area. That looks like something for me. And so I moved into stuff related to the menstrual cycle. And while all of this is happening, we have all of these wonderful technologies coming out, right? Much better insulin pumps, much better continuous glucose monitors, automated insulin delivery. And as this is happening, we can just see this shift in the demographics in type 1 diabetes. People are living longer and they're more active for longer periods of time. But we're also seeing now with this longevity, there are increases in complications that happen at a faster rate for people who are living with type 1 diabetes. So in my mind, I'm like, well, that's another really good area of research is how do we start preventing those complications? And so that would be things like, exercise and diet and, lifestyle in general. But I think exercise is a really key part of that.
So I can give you my charting of your research history from the bits that I've read and remembered. I certainly remember one of the first studies. I used to work for Medtronic, and I think you did a study on one of their sensors during your high interval training. And I always remember reading that. I think the MARD was about 20% of it in those days, if I remember from reading that paper. And I always remember reading it. I thought, oh, because at that point I knew who Mike Riddell was, and you some work with Mike. What was your relationship with Mike at that point?
Mike was actually on my doctoral thesis committee. He was part of the committee that helped sort of confirm, we'll say, the study designs, because I came up with the study designs, but then they had to be approved by my committee before we actually went and did them. And then once we had all of the data, we did a few secondary analyses, and the analysis of that sensor, of the accuracy of that sensor, that was a secondary analysis because we also had plasma glucose values from all of those sessions. So we were able to match the time points and then look at how closely they aligned.
Yeah, and then I think one of the two of the more recent papers, certainly for me, that I guess I don't know if it's cherry picking or not, but when you go looking at the data, you've kind of got a hunch for something, and you just that someone's done a piece of work on this. And it was the paper you're talking about was your sort of mini review on the effect of fasted versus non-fasted exercise. And something that has always struck me is not everything can be explained with diabetes, but for me, a lot of people's variability in glucose behavior can be explained by the amount of insulin they've got on board undertaking the activity versus not. And that clear show of resistance exercise or high intensity exercise done fasted, has a tendency to maybe elevate the glucose level, not in everyone, but on average. And then similarly on the same type of activity done in the post-meal period is completely different, which, like, to me, I have always said insulin board is king when it comes to glucose behavior. And it also sort of challenges that paradigm of when you used to go to exercise conferences, it was always, we'll show the type of exercise first. And if you're doing this exercise, you'll go up, and you're doing this as you go down. I was like, hang on a minute, there's one more important step before there is what's your insulin conditions before you start this thing. So whether it was just me looking for confirmation bias or not, but you certainly provided it for me, which was great.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of variability, as you said, in the response, and we do see some individuals who even with, I would say, moderately high levels of insulin can see their glucose levels go up just because they have such a pronounced adrenaline response, epinephrine response. But those people, I would say, are few and far between. I think a lot of the time we're looking at young male high-level athletes when we're seeing those responses.
Yeah, and I think that's also the context part, isn't it? It's kind of people talk about a rising glucose when people are sort of in stress and in competition. It's like, yeah, if you're going to do the Olympics, you're going to have that. But not everyone's competing in the Olympics. But yeah, so that kind of there. And I just recently come from Xtod, where again, what you're just describing to me was you kind of see this thing and you just can't help but be a magpie and attracted to it. You gotta go and have a look, and to really, and this is going to help me. It's going to help me and my wife. It's going to help me in life. I want to find out about this menstrual cycle. You can talk us through the different phases of it, what happens from an insulin resistance perspective. But it really made me sit up and think, oh wow, I'm seeing these young ladies in clinic, and they're having varying insulin dose requirements across the month. They are then also doing activities and exercise in these different parts. And at the moment, my advice remains the same for all those situations. So it kind of was a note to me to think, I need to understand more about this. So obviously, it's fantastic that you're on a week after to kind of dig into some of those questions and also highlight what we do and what we don't know. So I think a really good place to dive in. Now we've got an idea of we've charted your career trajectory to a degree, and that this is an area you're really interested in. And if we're focusing on sort of females, hormonal responses, and exercise, can you walk me through, because I definitely need educating on the sort of the phases of the cycle, what's generally happening, and then from an insulin perspective, particularly with type 1 diabetes, we're putting insulin from the periphery rather than the portal vein. What's the kind of things to be considering?
Okay, so let's see if we can break that down and not get too complicated, but get
Yeah,
all the right details.
yeah.
The menstrual cycle is generally broken down. I mean, you can see 3 or 4 phases depending on who's describing it to you. The follicular phase is that first sort of 10 to 14-ish, depending on how long the cycle is, because there is a lot of variability in cycle length. They say that the average is 28 days, but within the context of normal, I think I've seen anywhere from 21 to 40 days as being considered a normal cycle. So that means that when we're talking about follicular phase, luteal phase, obviously there's going to be a little bit of, stretching on either side, depending on whether you've got a shorter cycle or a longer cycle. So the follicular phase is right at the start. It is usually while the person is menstruating, and then it continues for a few days after that. And then we get into a peri-ovulatory phase. And the ovulatory phase, there's a bit of a change in core temperature at that stage of the game. Insulin resistance hasn't really upped just yet. We tend to see that more happening in the luteal phase, which is the last sort of 10-ish days, we'll say, towards the next menstruation. And it's in that luteal phase that we start seeing that insulin resistance rising. And so insulin needs will go up.
And what's the typical range of sort of days from there that does it happen gradually over these days, or is it bang from the start? What's driving that insulin resistance, do you think?
The data are limited, but what we're seeing in a lot of places is that it's generally like a 3-day-ish period where there's much more insulin needed to maintain the same blood glucose levels. And keep in mind that this is not all females either. There are some variables that still aren't completely understood, but as far as I can tell from the literature I've seen, it's about 2/3 of the females that you'll meet that will have that luteal phase insulin resistance. And it seems to be correlated with diagnosis prior to puberty. But again, there's some variability and the data are a bit sparse. So what else? And automated insulin. Sorry, I
Yeah,
was
no,
going
I
to
was
say.
just going you go for it. I was just going to say, what? So the hormones obviously changed in that point. So, what is the hormonal change that you think or you understand is driving that insulin resistance? Is it like progesterone or something like that, or is it not very clear?
I'm trying to remember because that's stuff I haven't reviewed much lately. I want to say that it is progesterone, and I actually have there was a review paper that I published with a couple of colleagues not too long ago that talks about basically women's health and in the context of type 1 diabetes. So we do get a rise in progesterone sort of in that last week of the luteal of the menstrual cycle in the luteal phase, the late luteal phase. So it correlates with that. Whether or not that's what's driving it, it's hard to say. There are also a couple of different peaks in estrogen throughout the cycle. There's one right before ovulation, and then it comes right down during the ovulatory period, and then it kind of rises again. So there's a bit of an ebb and flow. But that last part of the luteal phase is definitely where we see high progesterone and estrogen together. It's not the highest peak that we'll see for estrogen, but it is the highest peak that we'll see for progesterone. And then, some of the other hormones, what we call the trophic hormones, are a bit lower. So the luteinizing hormone, the follicle stimulating hormone. So yeah, it's
We're
correlation
into the weeds.
causation. Yeah, that's the thing, right? Is it a correlation causation? We do.
Well, I guess what we have is we have the phenotype. The phenotype is typically for 2/3 of women, there or thereabouts. You kind of hit this luteal phase. There is an insulin resistance. There's an increase in insulin requirement. And then does it just drop off very sharply, or is it a gradual decline?
Again, I think it depends, but I have heard from some women that it can drop off pretty sharply. To the point where they don't even have their period yet. They haven't started bleeding, and all of a sudden they're like, wow, why I'm just shoving carbs in my face and I'm low all the time. And then it's like, oh, that's why. So if they're tracking it, then oftentimes they'll see the signs, but if they're not, they'll have this period of being quite high where they need lots of insulin, which could be followed fairly abruptly by a period where they're going to have a lot more hypoglycemia and much lower insulin needs.
And this is a general idea question, because obviously I understand this is extremely variable on the individual. But if you're saying like someone needs 100% of their insulin is 30 units a day, just for example, during those luteal phases, are we kind of seeing elevation to needing like 33, 36, 39, 42 units, like a sort of a 30, the 10 to 30% increase in insulin requirements during those times? Is there any data on that?
There was a study recently published, and you know what? Since I have an extra screen here, I'm going to see if I can pull it out.
Okay.
This is one of the really nice things about automated insulin delivery, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
that we can see both the blood glucose levels and the insulin requirements. So let me just see if I can find. If I can't find it really quickly, then I'll pass. But I'll just sort of give
No, I
you
mean,
what.
just as you're looking, I'll do a bit of filling, because I remember looking at this because I was really interested one time at work. And is it called the catamenial insulin requirements or something like that? I've heard that name before, but I'm maybe just making it up. But certainly within that period, before automated insulin delivery systems, the plan for quite a few ladies who I used to see was, okay, let's set up a separate basal profile. And typically we would have it scale. We'd have 20% extra, 40% extra, 60% extra in terms of total like basal increases, and also carb ratios more aggressive. So then we'd set up like, this is your standard profile, and you've got like 20, 40, 60% extra based on making those settings stronger. So they could then hop between the the graded different rates to see whether which one works for which particular time. And that works quite effectively. But obviously, you need someone who's quite switched on during those periods. You need someone who's willing to kind of investigate and have a look. And to be quite honest, most people are just not into putting that level of detail in. And it'd be interesting to see whether these automated insulin delivery systems have the scaling properties built within them where such a short change in total daily dose can be identified and the correction factors and the systems are made strong enough to get on top of those. Because I certainly know from the under fives perspective, when they have these wicked changes in insulin sensitivity across the day, they struggle to keep up with those. And it kind of makes me think, I'm not so sure they're going to be able to deal with someone who's got this wicked insulin resistance from the luteal phase, for example.
So I'm looking at some of the data from that study I was talking about. It was published in Diabetes Technology and Therapeutics in 2025. The first author is someone by the last name Monroy. And the average glucose in the luteal phase, and this is automated insulin delivery. And again, I'm not sure if they specifically identified women with menstrual dysfunction. I don't think that's the case. I think their sample is just across the board, average females. And I seem to remember that it was a small enough sample size. I think it was 12. Yep, I see 12 participants here across 3 consecutive cycles. And what we're seeing is that the automated insulin delivery is not keeping up with it. So here they've got it in milligrams per deciliter, on average 131 in the follicular phase, 139.5 in the luteal phase. So it's not a huge difference, but it's enough to be noticeable. And that's in spite of, on average, it looks like about 4 more units of insulin per day. So if you're putting that through basal insulin delivery, I don't know what percentage that would be. But like the follicular phase, they're saying total insulin. If you want to put it per kilogram, it was 0.5 units per kilogram in the follicular phase, 0.6 in the luteal phase. But if they're going in just total units, it was 33.6 with some margin of variability, and then 37.2 in the follicular phase.
On average, over 10%, but within those 12 women, you're going to have some who have been hitting 20, 30% and some with very little, isn't it? And I think that's the interesting point is average is useful to a degree, but when you're the individual on the sharp end of an insulin resistance, you're not the average. You're the one who's requiring 20 or 30%, 40% more. And these systems are not going to keep up. And I think just off the bat, that's always worth thinking about. If you're a female out there and your experience, you've been told that these systems are going to keep up with your menstrual cycle needs, but your individual experience is very different. But then you're quoted, well, it only increases the insulin requirement by 10%. It's like, yeah, that's on average. I'm not the average person. I have got a wicked problem. And therefore, for you, there's probably lots of things you could consider to increase that dose that the system is giving. But I think what this has laid out nicely for me in my head is you've obviously got a fairly steady phase during the follicular what you're talking about. And then obviously as we're getting into this luteal phase, we're going to see maybe 3 or 4 days of increasing ramping up insulin requirements and then a fairly sharp drop off, which just speaks to, and also varying levels of estrogen along the way as well, which can impact which fuels people use for exercise. You've already can see in my mind how having males and females within the same study without accounting for menstrual cycle position is a huge confounder to the results between what you can draw from the average results of males and females thrown together from that study. Would that be a fair point?
Yes, I would say that it is a fair point. And so what we're trying to do now with most of our studies that involve both male and female participants is we try to test the female participants in the same phase of the menstrual cycle when we have a crossover study. So if we're trying to replicate the conditions in which they're doing 2 different tests so that we can compare between 2 tests, we try to have them come back in the same phase of the menstrual cycle. And if ever we're doing comparisons between the sexes, then we'll have them come once in the follicular phase, once in the luteal phase, because the follicular phase is actually more likely to be similar to the male physiology just because they don't have the bigger fluctuations in hormones at that stage. And so we can compare males versus, follicular phase females versus luteal phase females. And then we get a much better idea. And if we do see a difference between males and follicular phase females, then usually it's even more pronounced when we see that in the luteal phase.
So we've clearly got hormonal differences between males and females and what we're expecting to see both in general life in terms of insulin requirements, but certainly potentially within exercise. Talk to me a little bit or educate me around fuel utilization, because I know a couple of times, I remember the first time that I got this feedback, it was when I was on the ISPAD 2022 writing guidelines, and I think we put some sort of carbohydrate prescriptions, and then just your feedback was there was like, this is way too high for some of the females that I see. And it's like, but that's the kind of feedback that's needed, because again, for me at that point, 2022, this wasn't even on my radar. So I'm just thinking, the studies show 0.5 units per kilo. That's the same for everybody. Whereas obviously you're coming from a position of understanding in higher estrogen is likely higher free fatty acid utilization, therefore carbohydrate requirements will be less, maybe insulin on board's less because of the size of the female, therefore transposing one general recommendation to everybody is kind of easy to prescribe, but maybe isn't the most effective. So tell me a little bit about the kind of the differences in hormones and how that might affect the fuel, the substrates or fuels that are used during activity and exercise.
Well, again, we don't have a lot of data in type 1 diabetes. What we see in the literature for people living without diabetes is that, yeah, there is a tendency for fat to be a higher priority fuel source for females, and that is almost regardless of the type of exercise being performed. There still is that shift to using more carbohydrates at higher intensities. That's what we see across the board. But there just is a slightly higher proportion of fat in that mix, of lipids in that mix for female athletes. And they usually say that that has to do with estrogen, because estrogen does promote the use of fat as a fuel source during activity. One other thing to keep in mind with that 0.5 grams per kilogram is that a kilogram of a female is not the same composition as the kilogram of a male. What we tend to see in females is slightly lower lean body mass, slightly higher fat mass. And again, this is on average. We do get very elite female athletes who are very lean, and we also get some males who are a little less lean out there as well. But if we're looking at your typical active person who has a healthy body weight, there tends to be more lean body mass in a male body than there is in a female body. And so if you're just going on a per kilogram basis, it's likely to overestimate the needs for your female athletes.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point. I mean, it's my understanding it's not like a healthy body fat percentage for a male would be anywhere between 10 and 16%, whereas for a female would kind of be anywhere between 18 and 30% directionally. That just off the bat tells you, because of childbearing needs, et cetera, in the way that physiology is set up, you are going to have more fat mass than a female on average, and that's completely normal, healthy, etc. But then, as you say, when it comes to prescriptions of fuels, it's the muscles that are going to be using the vast majority of those fuels. So if there's lower muscle, there will be lower carbohydrate requirements. So again, transposing those generic, this is for everybody, which is easy to do, but may then, like you say, lead to overprescription of carbohydrate requirements for 15 to 20 to 30 minutes of exercise as a thing. So already we've got three major things. We've got hormones in terms of what the phase is, and also quite a big variability in terms of the impact of those. We've got potentially estrogen, maybe not impacting the fuel utilization, depending on the impact of insulin on board within there. And then we've got muscle mass, where again, males on average are typically going to have more muscle mass, more carbohydrate requirements per kilo. So that thrown all together then makes me think the information that we then give out, the guidelines that we do, and the education that we provide in mixed sessions is because most of the research has been done on males, fair to say?
That is very fair to say.
Then we're going to be in a situation where we're at risk of oversuggesting carbohydrate requirements, not taking into account the menstrual cycle phase that people are on. And also, again, not necessarily taking into fact that they're likely to be using less carbohydrates. So all in all, you're probably going to be getting an overprescription of carbohydrates in general, which I'm sure there's been many a female who's sat in an exercise education session who's gone, okay, so you're suggesting 0.5 to 1 gram per kilo. I weigh 70 kilos. You're suggesting an hour, 35 to 70 grams. Hell no. I'm going nowhere near that. That is going to send me through the roof. But we'll sit there and not say anything, because the best that the educator can do is roll out what they've been told by the guidelines. So I'm sure there's probably a lot of people listening to this are kind of going, all right, that's making a lot of sense now. Wow, I was suggested to have this, and it was like I tried it. It's like, wow, that was just way too much. What's been your experience? You've dealt with a lot of female athletes. You've dealt with a lot of female exercisers coming into your lab. Is that what they're saying?
What I've seen just in our acute studies, and with acute studies, we're supposed to have very strict protocols in terms of, when glucose drops to this level, we have to give X number of grams of carbohydrate. And they're usually, we're very careful, right? So we're supplementing as they're dropping to like 4.7, 4.8 millimoles per liter, which is probably a bit more aggressive than some people out there are doing, because a lot of them have been taught, oh, you don't need to take anything till you're at 4. So when we pull out the Dex 4 tabs, we tell the participant, our protocol says we're supposed to give you 4 of these, 16 grams. And I've had a lot of women look at me and go, do I really have to? And often they will not take the full 4, and we just have to make a note that they did not take the full 4. And when we do calculations at the end, we look to see how many people required supplementation, and we also look to see how much they took. But I have to say, I have not gone back to look at when we've had to supplement people during our studies. Have our female participants taken less than our males? I just know that I've had many of them be like, no, not doing that. But at the same time, there are so many confounders that you have to keep in mind there, right? Because I think that the female participants that come into my lab are also a bit more aware about what they're eating. There tends to be just women in our culture tend to be a lot more careful about their weight. It's a societal thing, right? And if they are, then maybe they're on a slightly lower carbohydrate diet. And maybe they do a more careful job of adjusting their insulin before exercise, because they say, hey, I don't want to eat to move. I want to move to keep in good health and a healthy body weight. And so it's really hard to compare, because, when people come in for an afternoon exercise session, we just ask them to follow a recipe. It's, decrease your basal rate by 50% 90 minutes before exercise, or decrease your meal bolus at lunch by, I think we usually say again, 50%. Whichever protocol it is, we have these set things that they're supposed to follow that are based on the guidelines. But we don't know what their starting point is. We don't know what that basal rate is that they're taking 50% of. And it may very well be lower, because they're just generally not eating as many carbohydrates. It's hard to tease out all of the factors that are involved here. But the one study that we do have where we compared males against females, it wasn't designed for that purpose, but we happened to do a secondary analysis. We did see that with resistance exercise, with weightlifting, the males had a bigger drop in glucose than the females. And that could be, as we were just discussing before, a bigger engine burning more fuel. It could be more careful pre-exercise insulin adjustments, or it could simply be the fuel that was selected during exercise. The data that we have can't really allow us to distinguish among those options.
Sounds like what we need is a kind of a study putting the guidelines to the test, males versus females, to actually see where the rubber meets the road. Because ultimately, I've sat on a couple of guidelines recently, both the ISPAD 2022 and the AID ones for 2024. And obviously, the prescriptions to carbohydrate are just generic. They're not male-female orientated, because there isn't the data to suggest either way. But there's probably enough signal to suggest there could be a difference. And as these guidelines get rolled out to everybody, taught by everybody, put everywhere for everybody. It would be interesting to have that kind of trial where you would see, the prescriptions given for males and females, how many people actually ended up in euglycemia versus not, between males and females, and see if there's any way of teasing out whether the overall effect is different for males and females. How many participants do you think you would need for that study to be worthwhile enough to make I wouldn't say a fully general statement, but to at least make the point that there is a difference, either or not? I mean, it might be that there isn't, and that's the whole point of doing science, isn't it? But there's theorizing, and then there's finding out. And the key of finding out is you need enough people to make sure that you don't swamp the numbers to make something statistically significant when it's clinically irrelevant, but at the same time, you want the numbers enough so that something that is found that is clinically relevant would also hit that statistical significance. So I know you can't be sat there with a power calculation, but in your head, how many males and females do you think you'd need to kind of put that sort of thing to the test?
Honestly, it would have to be quite large, because you have to consider the fact that the fitness level of the individual changes the situation, the age of the individual, the training experience. And that's not quite the same thing as the fitness level, because somebody who's done a lot of weightlifting will have a different response to aerobic exercise than somebody who's done a lot of training as a runner, for example. The insulin delivery, the insulin sensitivity. Now we're seeing all of these things about, it's different if you're diagnosed as an adult versus a child, because you might have residual insulin production. And then if you want to get into the weeds with the exercise physiology, the reason why it's really hard to get one of these projects funded in the first place is because there are sort of two schools of thought. One which says you have to compare people at the same relative intensity. So what that means is, I will go do an aerobic capacity test to find out what is the maximum speed I can run at. And then during a test, I will run at 60% of that speed. So that is a relative intensity. Whereas you'll also have people arguing that they should be doing the same absolute intensity. So if there's a man that's running at 6 miles an hour, or male, sorry, that's running at 6 miles an hour, the female should also be running at 6 miles an hour. But then that 6 miles an hour is going to be at a much higher relative effort for that female, which means she's going to tap into different fuels. So it's a messy situation. Yeah. And even the ones in, in people without diabetes, there's an extreme amount of variability in metabolism on the whole, which depends, on other hormones like thyroid hormone and growth hormone, which is a lot of genetics. And it could also depend on the temperature at which you're exercising. So you have to control that. Your hydration levels are going to play a role. Whether you slept well the night before is going to play a role. If you're fighting a virus, you're going to have a different response. There are just so many things. And even, if I'm talking about heart rate rather than blood glucose, these are all things that affect heart rate as well. And so if you just consider how much variability gets thrown into the mix, because sex also affects heart rate, by the way, it's going to be super hard to pull things out, which is why I often tell people to be their own scientist, because there is no other body like theirs.
So I think that actually is such an important point just to hone in on at this point, because I think what we've described is there's clear rationale for there to be differences in response. But even if there was a male-female difference in terms of carbohydrate requirements, whatever, within those groups, males and females, the actual response or requirements are going to vary massively due to all of the things that you just described. So the reality for a person living with diabetes is there's probably a sex difference. So directionally, females may require a bit less than is suggested by the guidelines in general. But from there, the actual rubber meets the road if you're prepared to test. If you're prepared on a personal level to try as best as possible understand the pre-exercise conditions, how much insulin's around, what phase of the menstrual cycle you're in, how many carbohydrates you take, etc. And then obviously observe the glucose response afterwards over a few times and find out what works for you. Because with that level of variability, as you've just described, in the reality of getting a randomized control trial that actually gets the answer, even if the answer was that females require less than males, trying to get an individual prescription based off that for said individual is just like, it ain't happening. It's not happening, but it'll be interesting to know. But I think, as you're describing there, that understanding the variables, the key players, be willing to test, be willing to adjust based on your own personal experience is the name of the game, essentially, from which people listening to this will obviously know. But I think certainly for me, it's been really interesting to get an understanding of, the hormonal differences, the timing differences, the differences in estrogen, difference in muscle mass, which I never really kind of thought about to the same degree. So that kind of puts us at a point where that's understood. But in terms in tactics, people listen to this podcast, and certainly for me in a clinical space, I would, if you're happy to, sort of present you with some challenging scenarios from a female perspective that I've come across as an educator, and options to overcome those challenges from what you know around sort of the female physiology and exercise and weight management, and also some of the changing modalities of therapy, which we've discussed, hormone, like hybrid closed loops. You game for the challenge?
Ooh, I don't know, because I remember I don't do anything clinically, right? I'm a geek.
Well,
I'm a nerd.
This isn't advice. this isn't advice. This is more kind of like just theorizing from what you know. I'll tell you what, I will present the case and what I would do, and you tell me, does that make sense from a physiology standpoint? How's that?
Okay, so or I could try. I'm game. I'll try anything once. But keep in mind that I do not work clinically. So if I'm missing part of the picture, you'll let me know.
Absolutely not. No, that's fine. So a lot of especially young girl, when I say young girls aged 12 and upwards. So I generally will see children and young people, but I've worked in adults before. So this is based on my recent experience in sort of the 12 to 18, but previously worked in adults, and often females and males as well, to be honest, but females specifically will come and say, look, I've gained weight since starting taking insulin. And I've got to a point now where I really need to shift some weight. And when I do the calculations, they're generally above 1 unit of insulin for every kilo that they weigh. So you've got a 70 kilo person, they're like on 80, 90 units of insulin, 1.2, 1.3 units per kilo. And I guess this is my understanding, is people with type 1 diabetes put the insulin into the periphery. They don't put it into the portal vein. So they have circulating around their muscles, around their fat tissues, a circulating level of insulin that's between 4 and 8 times the amount that a person without diabetes doesn't. They have a higher level, 4 to 8 times in their portal vein and a much less in their periphery. And the reason why I understand that to be important is I always think of the fat cells is what we want to do when someone wants to lose weight. What they're really talking about is losing fat. They want to liberate some of the fat stores from inside the fat cell. And the way that I describe it, which I hope is right, is on the indoor to the fat cell is lipoprotein lipase, which is an enzyme which basically allows fat to enter. And on the outdoor is hormone-sensitive lipase, which is the outdoor. When that's open, fat flows out. So when you've got a high circulating peripheral level of insulin, my understanding is the indoor lipoprotein lipase is wide open. It says, come inside, all the fat goes in. But the hormone-sensitive lipase, the door is firmly shut when that peripheral circulating insulin is very high. So it's a kind of all in, very little out. So then as soon as the female starts to reduce their calorie intake, the peripheral circulating insulins don't drop that much. So what they're doing is they're starving from the outside because they're hardly putting anything in, yet they're still unable to liberate their fat stores, and they're absolutely starving from the inside as well. And they give up because the calorie deficit is just too harsh because they don't have the fuels, and their body's like, Whereas if you did the same, I would say if you had an identical twin who didn't have type 1 diabetes, as soon as you drop your calorie intake like that, the peripheral circulating level of insulin would go really low. The indoor would be fairly closed on the fat cell, and the outdoor would be wide open, and all this fat would come out, not all of it, but a good portion of fat would come out to supply the surplus energy requirements that's there. So that initial phase of just trying to do it by food alone pretty much always fails. It always fails because of this simple problem of starving from the outside, starving from the inside. Is that physiological? Am I in the right arena there in the way that I'm describing it?
That hits the nail on the head pretty well, and a lot of it. I mean, insulin is by its nature a storage hormone. And so, our body's usually regulating it very precisely if the pancreas is doing its job. So when it's not, and you have high insulin, it does tend to put you in that favoring the storage mode at all times, basically.
So then comes the problem. So then I try and I suggest, well, what we need to do is get you more sensitive to insulin so we can drop your insulin requirements to give this thing a chance. And then it comes about when's the best time to do it. And then traditionally you'd say, oh, well, there's a couple of options. We can do it just after a meal and try and reduce the insulin dose, or we can maybe do it 4 hours after eating to try and do it when the bolus insulin has gone. But as I'm finding out, and I've known for quite a while, our typical explanation of insulin that we give for a meal is, it peaks at 2 hours and lasts 4 is actually shortchanging the real effect. It's more like peaks at 2 hours and lasts up to 6 hours. And if you've got accumulating boluses during the day, you're never going to be doing that activity in a very low insulin condition to allow fat to be liberated. And I'm sort of teeing you up here because obviously your work speaks to this particular thing where you're talking about, different glucose responses in different states. What would be the best time for a female who is having this insulin challenge to do activity to get access to those fat stores?
Yes, this comes into the whole fasted exercise topic that we've been looking at, and in our mind, it really just started more as the hypoglycemia side of things, right? Because there is a tendency to avoid exercise altogether because of fear of hypoglycemia. It is the biggest barrier to exercise for people living with type 1 diabetes. And most people exercising in a fasted state, regardless of what type of exercise you're doing, we see a much smaller drop in glucose, and even for a lot of people, a rise in glucose if you do exercise first thing in the morning before breakfast. And obviously the advantage, there is one in terms of insulin on board. If you haven't eaten in 8 hours or longer, you don't have any of those boluses left in circulation. Automated insulin delivery might actually increase your basal rate in the morning. It's not unusual. A lot of people have a rise in glucose, the dawn phenomenon, as it's called. And that's associated, we think, with increases in growth hormone and cortisol. Those are two hormones that essentially train your body to not use glucose. It promotes fat as a fuel source, but that's why, again, that fasted exercise, it's not just the IOB, it's also that you've got these mediators that encourage your body to use more fat as a fuel source. But they do also make you a little bit insulin resistant at that time of the morning. And so we do see some people that will go do their exercise session. It'll last, 30, 60 minutes, whatever it might be. And glucose keeps going up for a while after exercise. So it doesn't necessarily help decrease all the insulin doses, because you might have to give a little bolus at the end of exercise to bring glucose back down. But that being said, if you're consistently training, and especially if you're doing the types of activities that help increase muscle mass, this usually means that you have a bigger sink for your glucose, like more place to store it. And it also translates to lower doses of insulin to be able to manage what it is that you have in your diet on a regular basis.
So, that could be, if someone was listening, obviously always check with your healthcare provider before undertaking any of these things. There's always the disclaimer, but to me, it makes a lot of sense. So if we know that peripheral circulating insulin in high doses is really going to stop your capacity to access your fat stores, and doing it first thing in the morning is the best chance of doing it in the lowest insulin conditions to allow those fat stores to be liberated. Not only on top of that, you then for the rest of the day will have depleted some glycogen within your liver, some glycogen within your muscle cells, which will make your body more sensitive to the insulin you're going to give for the rest of the day, and therefore may actually over time lead to a reduction in peripheral circulating insulin. And especially, as you said, if you're going to throw in some resistance exercise in there as well and increase those muscle fiber sizes, you then become a bigger storage of glucose, which again gives your body's ability to require less insulin if you've got sort of more ability to store those things within there. So there's probably a lot to be said for fasted exercise in the morning, apart from you got to get your ass out of bed and you got to do it. That's the hard bit.
And coffee is allowed. Coffee is, if
Yes.
you're still considered fasting if you have coffee, as long as it's black. Don't have any cream, don't have any sugar. And you know what? It's not exactly a well-kept secret in the exercise science world either. People have been doing this for a very long time. If they're involved in bodybuilding, in fitness competition, and they're getting close to that competition date and they have to do what's called cutting to try and lean out to get rid of some of that fat mass, they will often do their aerobic exercise first thing in the morning because they want to maximize that fat burning. And it's a tactic that's been used for a long time in different types of fitness competitions.
Well, bodybuilders know a lot. I mean, I used to go to the gym and do sort of, no, I wouldn't say bodybuilding, but I used to lift weights, but I used to go there with a lot of bodybuilders. And just as you described, I'll get into the gym maybe 9 o'clock in the morning. Those guys have been on the treadmill for 2 hours, walking just at a steady pace, coffee in hand. Like, what are you doing now? Just burning the fat. Just burning the fat. I actually got Yanis, one of my mates. He's a natural bodybuilder. He's won a few competitions. He's going to come on and tell us what it takes with type 1 to kind of get as lean as they do. And I'm absolutely sure he'll be talking fasted cardio, get the insulin conditions low, and obviously caffeine as well is going to increase your fat burning potential as well through epinephrine and norepinephrine as well. So yeah, if you're struggling, it's well, I mean, it almost sounds like you get extra brownie points if you got type 1 diabetes. Like, fasted exercise is good for general people wanting to lose weight or certainly lose fat. But if you've got type 1 diabetes and peripheral circulating of insulin is a problem, then first thing in the morning really does offer that advantage on top of all the different types of activity at a much lower risk of going low as well, and requiring supplementary carbohydrates. So
Another thing to note is if you're struggling with the planning side of it, because I know a lot of people have a hard time, like, am I going to go to the gym this afternoon? Am I not? Oh, look, I actually have time to go, but I didn't set my pump to a temporary basal or a temporary target an hour and a half ago. If you do that exercise first thing in the morning, we've even seen a lot of our participants coming in and not having any problems without any insulin adjustments. They just roll out of bed and go, and they're fine without adjusting any targets, any basal rates. So there is something to be said that if planning is difficult for you with afternoon exercise, that morning window seems to be almost safe without adjustments.
Well, this is probably coming out around the time of New Year. So if you're on a New Year's resolution, this is the time to think, okay, this is, if you understand the challenges with type 1 diabetes and weight management and units per kilo and high circulating peripheral level of insulin is a real barrier to burning fat. This does offer one unique advantage in terms of the timings from both a hyperglycemia risk, which is low, but also accessing your fat stores. So that sounds. I'm sure there's a lot of people who will be happy to hear that.
So there's one thing to note, though, and it's a question that I've been asked, and we don't have an answer because I know this is something that there's somebody out there thinking it. What about intermittent fasting? If you're fasting until noon and then you decide to go exercise at noon, does it still work? I have no idea.
Theory would say yes, though. Theory would say yes because my theory would be, if we're saying, as we described earlier, that actual bolus insulin has got a tail of 6 hours, and part of the problem why people think they're doing fasted exercise when they're not after 4 hours is there's still a significant tail of that insulin if the bolus is large enough. But if you've taken that out of the game till lunchtime and you're still only working on whatever basal is required to keep the suppressed glucose from the liver getting out, you would think that would be all sample. I mean, that would be an interesting exercise study. Fasted exercise versus intermittent exercise at lunchtime to see if there's any differences.
Remember that, you've got growth hormone and cortisol that are also putative. We don't actually have the measurements, but they could be mediators of what we see with that increase in glucose. And those tend to rise first thing in the morning, but they fall by lunch. And so in some ways, if we did that, fasted in the morning versus fasted at lunch, it could also give us a bit of an answer as to, whether it's just the IOB or if those hormones are actually playing an important role in mediating glucose as well.
Well, you've now got your next research project, the magpie. I can see the magpies kicking in there now. You're thinking, oh, there's one to put to the ethics board. Okay, good. One thing that you did mention that I think is be definitely interesting for the people who've reached out is we've covered obviously a lot about males, females, the differences, the things to think about, and we've covered some tactics for potentially thinking about exercise in the morning. What about sort of perimenopause, menopause, where obviously the hormone levels are changing? How does that impact on everything that we've kind of been through? Because that is probably something that is never discussed within education.
Yeah, well, I mean, menopause is only something that's just being discussed in the general population these days, right? For the longest time, it was like, don't talk about it. Um, but yeah, we don't have a ton of data in type 1 diabetes again. Perimenopause, obviously, you go from having these nice regular cycles, or fairly regular anyway, of estrogen and progesterone to all of a sudden just having a random spike here and there and having no idea when it's coming. So managing glucose through perimenopause is going to be a little chaotic, I think, in general. But we don't really have any data to show that. I'm just surmising based on what we know from the hormonal fluctuations. We have one database in Europe that has generally shown that over the menopause transition, insulin needs decrease, which isn't surprising when you consider what happens to the female body. There tends to be a loss of lean muscle mass, an increase in fat mass, and metabolic rate in general slows down through that menopause transition. So it shows. I'm trying to remember, it was basal insulin needs decrease, but bolus seems to stay about the same. And again, that's one database, and I don't even know if it was longitudinal. I think that might have just been sort of cross-sectional, which, we can say there's a correlation, but we don't really know about causation. What we do know is that with increasing age, and this is particularly marked in females with type 1 diabetes, we see it a bit in males with type 1 diabetes, but it's worse in females. Once we get past that menopause transition, there is a really big increase in cardiovascular risk. There is also a faster loss of muscle mass and muscle strength, and a faster loss of bone density and bone quality. And what you have to remember is that risk of fragility, of falls, and of not being able to do your activities of daily living once you get into your 60s, 70s, and 80s. It is all related to the peak at which you manage to find yourself in life, where your muscle and bone health is concerned. And that peak for a lot of women happens sort of in the 20s and 30s. And then the more active you are, the longer it stays high. So that really speaks to how important it is. It's not like I'll exercise when I retire because that's when it'll be more important. No, by the time you retire, a lot of the damage is done. You have to start those activity levels, ideally, in childhood and adolescence, and get to the highest peak possible, so that you can then maintain that peak by keeping up those activity levels with resistance exercise, so weightlifting, with weight-bearing activity, walking, jogging, skipping, anything like that, dancing even, because everyone loves dancing, right? And then we see that those declines are just a little slower, and that functional mobility, the ability to put a jar on a high shelf, the shoulder strength, the shoulder mobility, those things tend to stay longer if we just do a better job of moving throughout the entire lifespan.
Yeah, I mean, that obviously speaks to obviously the general population as well, but now we're seeing people, fortunately and thankfully, with type 1 diabetes having both improved glucose control, lipid control, blood pressure control, the three major sort of drivers of cardiovascular risk, certainly from a type 1 diabetes context, are obviously staying more in target we'd like to see. So we're seeing people living healthier for longer, which is fantastic. But then obviously comes into a whole new set of challenges that are unknown. But those general principles of incorporating weight bearing and things that are going to stress your bones to make sure that they stay strong. And then, as you said, don't diminish quickly as you go along. A sort of key messages for overall health, but I guess again, extra brownie points. If you've got type 1 diabetes with your cardiovascular risk being higher, you want to make sure that those things are maintained as you kind of move along. So I guess one topic that we haven't covered, and I don't know what your experience is with this, but is kind of pregnancy. Have you done any sort of work within pregnancy and type 1 diabetes, especially around the activity perspective? Obviously, activity is going to be a good thing. Of course it is. Are there any watch outs or any things for women to consider from an exercise perspective?
So, I mean, pregnancy is a field that you can specialize in and of itself. And I'm showing my jack of all tradesness here in that I'm not really a master of any of the things we've talked about. But I've been doing a lot more reading on the pregnancy side of things, simply because it's so obvious that movement is a very big part of a healthy pregnancy. But as soon as you put that in the context of type 1 diabetes, where they're saying, oh, absolutely no hyperglycemia during pregnancy, it's bad for the baby. Absolutely no hypoglycemia during pregnancy, it's bad for the baby. Well, now all of a sudden you've got somebody who's already got a lot of barriers to being physically active, and they're absolutely terrified of, doing anything that might damage the life that's growing inside them. The thing is that with type 1 diabetes, there are higher risks associated with pregnancy. So preeclampsia, which is related to blood pressure, is higher in type 1 diabetes. Macrosomia, which has to do with the size of the baby. You tend to have bigger babies in women with type 1 diabetes. Large for gestational age is a similar thing, except one has a relative cutoff and one has an absolute cutoff. But basically, it just comes down to bigger babies. Premature delivery is higher. Even stillbirth is higher with type 1 diabetes. But all of these things, we know that, in the general population, women who are more active during their pregnancy tend to have lower rates of all of those complications. So the question is, what do we recommend and how do we make it safe? And unfortunately, for the time being, we don't really have a lot in terms of data. We have a single study where they had a very controlled environment and had these female participants come in, and they actually did quite a lot of exercise in a 24-hour period. It ended up being about 160 minutes of walking. And it did have a significant impact on their blood glucose levels. It was, much more time in range on the day where they were doing all of that walking. But that's definitely not realistic for most people to be able to do. I think we have to go in small steps here in that, the first step is just going to be sit less. Decrease the sedentary time. The more you move, the better it is for blood flow, the better it is for everything in your body. It doesn't necessarily have to be exercise, right? Because we can make that distinction between exercise and physical activity. Physical activity is just movement of any kind for any purpose, whereas exercise is for that purpose. It's planned and for training, for improving your physical fitness. So for now, without any data to say this is how you adjust your insulin, I think what a lot of people should be saying is, okay, let's make an effort to just not sit, move around more, see if you can get in some walks, like try to keep a certain level of activity to keep the body healthy, because the healthier the body is. And obviously the tighter that range of glucose, the more we can stay in range, the better. But as pregnancy, evolves, once you get into that second and third trimester, there's really heavy insulin resistance. And there's often a lot of gestational weight gain in type 1 diabetes. And to be able to prevent these would do a lot for improving the delivery experiences and the overall health of mom and baby. So again, if you want to maintain its insulin sensitivity, or at least, have less of a decrease, being active is an important part of that. And, there are even problems with lactation after delivery in women with diabetes who experience pregnancy. So it's, there are just so many things that we don't know enough about. But in my mind, as long as you can do it safely and keep glucose levels in that nice range, exercise, or at least physical activity, and a decrease in sedentary time should be strongly encouraged.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like from what you're saying there, and I've heard I've heard a few people on pregnancy speak around sort of activity and sort of similar thing. So there's limited evidence, but what we do know, certainly from the walking literature, is if you're trying to keep that post-glucose level below 7.8, walking is going to be your friend because it's going to enhance the action of insulin. So if you've not managed to bolus before and you're drifting and you're heading up there, going for a 15-20 minute walk is going to be the best thing rather than giving you more insulin to getting you back into range. So you can just use short doses in there, just activity to try and maintain your time in pregnancy range, but also lower your insulin requirements. And potentially, even from what we discussed before, if we know that the insulin on board is going to be high, especially as a very aggressive management of glucose levels, then if you're going to do exercise, then first thing in the morning would be the low hanging fruit in terms of minimizing your hypoglycemia risk while maximizing the opportunity to do that exercise, which may be a step above the activity. So that may be something worth thinking about if people are concerned about hypoglycemia risk, for instance. Does that sound reasonable?
That sounds very reasonable.
I'm certainly no pregnancy expert, that's for sure, but it certainly sounds along those similar themes. So I want to be respectful of your time. So we're coming up onto an hour. So I'm going to reflect back to you some of the things that I've learned. So I think that probably the biggest learnings for me are obviously there. I now understand the female menstrual cycle a lot better than I did before, which my wife would definitely be happy about. The luteal phase is the time where we're expecting, if we're going to see it, maybe in directionally 60 to 70% of people, an increase in insulin requirements. One automated insulin delivery study suggests that could be about a 10% increase, although that 10% being the average, that could be a wicked range from nothing up to sort of 50%. If you sit on the 50% side, it's very unlikely that these systems are going to be able to scale up the insulin in those 3 to 4 days. So if you see that happen frequently, then you're going to need to think about some alternative strategies, a way to supercharge how much extra insulin is given. And there's plenty of ways you could think about to do that. But knowing that that's a possibility, I think, is important. And also, if you're not on automated insulin delivery system and you're on standard injections or pump therapy, I already described some of the strategies that we used to do. We used to have, basal profiles with 20, 40, 60% extra ready to go when those times kick in. So if you understand what's happening, there's always a way to challenge that. I'd also learned, which I kind of knew but never really applied that knowledge, was carbohydrate requirements are units per kilo, but per kilo on average of muscle mass is not going to be as high in females as it is for males. Therefore, those could be over-egging how much you need. So kind of taking those two things on a simple level is going to mean probably, on average, females might require a little bit less more carbohydrate for exercise than males. Not always, but potentially directionally. So as an educator, that's worth having in your mind. As a person with diabetes, that's worth having within your mind as well. But obviously, what you then discussed is the need to be your own scientist. Test, see what happens, review those kind of results. And as in this podcast, the glucose never lies. If your glucose results stay in target, whatever you did worked. Keep doing that. If it didn't work, then you just need another strategy. But having that background understanding of what might be happening is really helpful in progressing that journey faster rather than just blindly going in with guesswork. You've got an understanding as to what might happen. And then obviously you've developed the conversation around, we put some scenarios around when's going to be the best time if you're looking to liberate fat in a high insulin on board condition. Then fasted exercise would be a very, very good option for you. Low hypoglycemia risk, maximum potential to burn fat and remain insulin sensitivity across the day. And then the other thing that really made me think about the cohort of I support is, regardless of all this fat burning, etc., and losing weight, how about getting peak bone mass? How about getting peak muscle mass, which is going to require you to put some stress on your body, especially from the ages of 12 to 30, where your body's going to be on the biggest chance of getting as strong and as heavy boned as possible, is going to protect you in the long term from decline in muscle mass and bone mass. So regardless of whether you're doing it to lose weight or whatever, your future health is going to depend on getting as strong as is possible for you up into that 25-30 range. Does that cover about, is that a fair summary of what we've been through? Is there anything else that you want to throw in or leave the listeners with in terms of what to look out for, what to think about, or where they can catch more from you if they're really interested in the work you're doing?
Um, well, actually, one thing that came to mind while you were going through all the menstrual cycle stuff is if you are a person whose needs changes drastically during that luteal phase, keep in mind that physical activity does increase insulin sensitivity, and that you might have more insulin on board when you start activity just from having that higher basal rate. So you might need to make a slightly larger adjustment for exercise if you're doing it postprandially in the luteal phase. And again, that's something where we have some data. It's not published yet. Just something to keep in mind while you're doing your scientific self-experiment.
So if people are interested in your work, where's the best place to keep up to date with what's going on with your research? Or if people wanted to reach out and contact you, are you game for that?
I am easily available online. My email address, both at the University of Montreal and at the Montreal Clinical Research Institute, which is known as IRCM. We, at the moment, are mostly doing acute studies where you actually have to show up in the lab. There are some still going on in Edmonton, Alberta, and the rest in Montreal. However, there are a few studies from time to time where surveys are required. If they are listening to this podcast, if you're listening to this podcast and you live in Canada, I would recommend that you reach out to the Better Registry. Go to type1better.com and you can register to be a part of the registry by answering a couple of surveys. Anyone else who wants to can go to type1better.com and poke through all of the resources that have been made available for people living with type 1 diabetes on a vast array of topics from a ton of experts in the field. So that's about it for me.
I will definitely put a link to that in the show notes. I checked out some of those resources, and for people who've been they're made by people who've been in this field for a long time, and they're really high quality. I have to say they're very good. So I'll put a plug for those and put those in the show notes. I just want to say thank you. First of all, you've given up obviously an hour of your time here to do the podcast, but also personally to me, I've reached out several times to get some ideas on different things and about some ideas, and you've been more than gracious with your time and your thoughts, and you've always helped my learning, and certainly your feedback on the ISPAD guidelines 2022 made me realize I needed to up my game, which is always always important as well. So I just say thank you. I appreciate you, and I look forward to what's to come.
Well, thank you for allowing me to talk about all the things that I love to talk about. And, I find we don't always get the information into the hands of the people who need it the most, which is why I really enjoy doing podcasts like yours.
All right. Well, stay safe, and I'll catch up with you soon.
Thank you.